Today we're bringing home Paul, Evan, Alsu, Vladimir. 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder. All 4 have been imprisoned unjustly in Russia, and now their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free.
Happening now, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan will soon be heading home. President Biden at the White House calling their release an incredible relief to their families and a feat of diplomacy, while thanking those allies who worked with the administration on the complex deal.
Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, they all stepped up, and they stood with us. They stood with us. And they made bold and brave decisions. Released prisoners being held in their countries who are justifiably being held, and provided logistical support to get the Americans home. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter.
More than a dozen prisoners, along with Gershkovich and Whelan, were released by Russia in exchange for Russian prisoners held by the United States and countries throughout Europe. In all, it was a 24-person prisoner swap, one of the largest since the end of the Cold War, and it comes after months of tense negotiations behind the scenes between the U.S. and NATO allies. The Hill's national political reporter Kate Martell joins us to talk about this major breaking story today. And more, Kate, let's get right to it. This large-scale prisoner swap is viewed as a successful negotiation process at the highest levels of government. But the U.S. and Russia historically have had an adversarial relationship. What does this mean for relations between the two countries going forward?
Margaret, this is certainly a move in the right direction. That being said, tensions between the U.S. and Russia are still incredibly strained. I will say this is incredible news that the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was part of this prisoner swap. But that being said, this was welcomed and expected. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin said in an interview a few months ago that he was open to this prisoner swap. So it was welcomed and expected. That being said, the relations between the two countries are still incredibly frosty. And when President Biden spoke a few minutes ago, he was asked whether he'd want to speak with Putin directly, and he said, nope, not necessary. So that kind of tells me everything I need to know about U.S. and Russia's relations. It's been strained for a while, and while this is certainly a move in the right direction, it doesn't necessarily reset everything because, having an American journalist imprisoned as part of this prisoner swap was, not necessarily a good look for Russia and certainly made things a bit tenser between the two countries.
And a consequential and momentous day now that these prisoners are coming home. Now, turning to campaign news, Donald Trump is facing backlash for his combative appearance yesterday at a conference for Black journalists, where he questioned Vice President Kamala Harris's racial identity. His running mate now also doubling down on those remarks. Kate, we're still months away from an election, but could these controversial comments change the direction of the 2024 race?
Not necessarily this small development, but I think overall this certainly adds to, the theme of President Trump being chaotic on the campaign trail and as president, that it certainly will not help him. Now, speaking to this Black journalist conference certainly came with some risks for former President Trump. And, he made a bit of an unforced error here by, what he had to say. He had to toe the line to be careful in how he talked about Vice President Harris, and the comments that he used did frustrate and anger a lot of Democrats in Washington. Now, I will say we are 3 months away from the presidential election, and certainly the stories like this do not help him, that this is the type of chaos that I think a lot of Republicans and certainly most Democrats do not want to replicate in the next administration. So, when former president, the more he talks about policy, I think can help him. But while he talks about personal issues like this and mocks Vice President Harris's heritage and questions it, those are certainly headlines that are not welcomed from Republicans, and I think do not necessarily help him or help his lead on the campaign trail, Margaret.
Kate, the Harris team is saying Trump's latest comments are simply a taste of the chaos and division that are the hallmarks of Trump's campaign. And Harris herself is once again calling on Trump to debate. What's been his response?
So it's interesting is that when former President Trump was first asked if he wanted to debate Harris, he said absolutely. Then his campaign followed up and said, well, we're not going to commit yet until she's formally the nominee. And then Trump in turn said he'd probably be able to debate her. Now, what's interesting about this is that Harris has certainly found a way to get under Trump's skin, that this has certainly opened him up to attacks from the Democrats and the presidential campaign of Vice President Harris, because she's a former prosecutor and can cast doubts on whether President Trump is able to debate her and is able to go on offensive. So, as far as Harris is concerned, this is a big win in them raising doubts over whether he would debate her. That being said, most officials say that they do expect the two will end up debating each other. When it was Biden versus Trump, the debate was expected for September 10th and was going to be hosted by ABC News. Now there's some question over the venue, the hosts, or potentially the format of the debate. But so far what we're hearing is the debate will likely happen. That being said, any doubts that are being cast are certainly being used by the Harris campaign to try to get under Trump's skin. And, some of the comments that I'm seeing so far, it does seem to be working.
Some Republicans are starting to send warnings to the Trump campaign, indicating they want the former president to stop focusing on race and instead focus on policy. What's been the overall reaction from the party?
The overall reaction is that August recess is incredibly well timed. This is not an issue that Republicans, particularly on Capitol Hill, want to address. When you have these sorts of controversies, famously, a lot of Republicans do not want to necessarily weigh in. They want to focus more on the policy issues. So the reaction that I'm seeing so far is, let's return to talking about policy and let's stop making it so much about politics and personal issues. This is not, I think, an issue that Republicans want to focus on. That being said, we're seeing Senator J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, did come out to his boss's defense and called the response from Vice President Harris hysterical and compared her to a chameleon. So far, I think we're so far seeing that Republicans are trying to stay away from this as much as possible. But, we expect his running mate, unsurprisingly, came to the defense of his boss.
Now, personal attacks aside, Republicans want to portray Harris as a liberal responsible for illegal border crossings and high inflation. They also have the narrative forming on her flip-flops when it comes to policy, including fracking. Kate, how vulnerable is Harris for walking back her stance on fracking?
So she is a bit vulnerable, but I will say that for the past few years, Harris has been linked with the Biden administration's proposals, not necessarily her own personal policy proposals. So it kind of puts Republicans in a tough spot, that they want to hone in on any policy differences that she makes and any reversals, and they're going to try to find as many as possible. Now, fracking sure gave an opening to Republicans for that. She's recently reversed her position on fracking and has moved more to the center. She no longer supports this ban on fracking, despite running on that in 2020. And I will say what's interesting to note is that she's trying to court some swing voters in states like Pennsylvania. That's a big gas producing state, and it's tied to a lot of jobs in the state. So overall, this might dampen some of the excitement and enthusiasm from progressives that she has flipped on this issue. But also at the same time, I think Democrats are looking more broadly at how can this help the electorate and how can she adjust some of her policy positions to help them electorally and help bring her to the center to maybe bring in more of those independent votes, Margaret.
When it comes to voter enthusiasm, Harris has actually halved Trump's 2024 lead, according to a new national polling average by the Cook Political Report. With her recent surge in a number of various national polls, Kate, do you get the sense that it is more about her popularity over Biden's at this point? Or is this uptick a result of voters' positive opinions about Trump now cooling?
What I'd actually attribute this is to this newfound excitement for Democrats. There had been a lot of concerns about President Biden's health, and I think it had sucked some of the energy away from Democrats in the election. She's now this fresher face, while she was part of the Biden administration, that she wasn't necessarily the top of the ticket. So we're seeing Democrats are trying to capitalize on that as much as possible. They've been successful so far. And as the poll, as you mentioned, and a few other polls that have come out, that we have seen that this excitement has translated into polling. Like you mentioned, it did. Her lead, or Trump's lead, I should say, over Harris has been halved, and there's been other polling to reflect that. A new Bloomberg poll actually showed that she erased most of Trump's lead in 7 battleground states, and some recent polling from The Hill and Emerson showed that most of the battleground state pollings are now within the margin of error. So I would attribute this to this newfound excitement from Democrats, but also at the same time, voters are getting to know her personally. It does come with a bit of risk. She is fairly untested politically because, while she did run in California, she didn't have a successful campaign nationally, and she didn't make it through the primary season. So it does come with some risk, but I think we're seeing some of this polls reflecting this honeymoon stage that Democrats are going to try to really capitalize on.
Kate, I'm sure you're familiar with this one. It's long been Washington's favorite parlor game, the Veep Stakes. Right now, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is said to be leading contender for Harris, and she's presumably going to make her announcement about a running mate on Tuesday in Philadelphia. That's another fresh sign it could, in fact, be Shapiro. At this point, progressive activists are expressing deep concerns about him. Kate, what exactly are their reservations?
The reservations that I'm hearing from progressives is they have some concerns over the way that his past positions on school vouchers have been. They also think that he isn't necessarily aligned with some progressives on the Israel-Hamas war. So, progressives do have some of these concerns. But that being said, I think a lot of Democrats are trying to rebut with the fact that he has a winning reputation in Pennsylvania, that he was able to have a successful campaign. And Pennsylvania is a very important state electorally. It has 19 electoral college votes, though it's a very key state for Democrats if they want to win in November. And so while there are some concerns from progressives, at the same time, some Democrats are making the argument that Governor Shapiro is a way to go when bringing some more votes to Vice President Harris's campaign.
Trump's own VP pick, J.D. Vance, has been an outspoken critic of supporting aid to Ukraine, causing some tension in the Republican Party. The war in Ukraine is not the only issue where there is a divide. Kate, frame the debate here. How are more traditional and hawkish Republicans feeling about the campaign's more isolationist approach right now?
Yeah, this isolationist approach is not historically what we think of when we think of the Republican Party, that Republicans, historically were fairly hawkish and national security driven. And, by former President Trump choosing J.D. Vance, it was sending the Republican Party in a different direction and sending a message. Now, when we had the fight over sending aid to Ukraine earlier this year, J.D. Vance led the opposition to sending this aid to Ukraine. So that tells you the direction that Trump is sending the campaign. And, I would argue that, Trump is winning this debate over more of these hawkish, national security driven Republicans. There is some concern among these Republicans that we're starting to see air. There's been some reporting from my colleagues at the Hill that, some Republicans are concerned about Senator J.D. Vance as the choice for Trump's running mate, because it certainly sends a message on foreign policy at a time when, you have a lot of things raging in the Middle East and the war on Ukraine, that this really does send this message over, where is the Republican Party headed in the future, and how do former President Trump and Senator J.D. Vance in a future administration, how do they want to frame this foreign policy debate?
Turning to the Middle East, there are growing concerns across the globe about recent calls for revenge against Israel after the assassination of a top Hezbollah commander. Kate, what has Iran's response been, and what type of retaliation are we expecting here? Is there a risk of a greater expansion of war in the Middle East?
There's a pretty big risk of, an expanding war in the Middle East. We're at such an incredibly tense time. And while Israel has not claimed responsibility for the Hamas leader being assassinated, for the Iranian leader being assassinated, they did confirm that a Hamas leader was killed in an airstrike in July. That, Israel does continue to go after some of these Hamas leaders and continues to escalate and aggravate situations in the Middle East. Now, as far as the retaliation goes, there's a few different directions that Iran can go, but one of the plausible options that I've been hearing that Iran could use some of its allies in the Middle East, that's Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, to have a more coordinated attack and to retaliate. So overall, the situation in the Middle East is incredibly tense, And these situations that you're describing is only continuing to inflame it. And it has some worries over what could happen with these ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas that the U.S. and a lot of allies are pushing for, or hoping that can continue to not continue to be inflamed. And issues like this, and when we see developments like this, I think it worries people even more over what could be this aggression in the Middle East and how could this war escalate, Margaret.
All right, we'll leave it there. The Hill's national political reporter, Kate Martell, thanks for being on.
Thank you.
The U.S. has struck a plea deal with 3 prisoners accused of arranging the 9/11 attacks. The 3 were jointly charged in 2008 and 2012 in connection to the attacks in the World Trade Center that killed nearly 3,000 people. The New York Times reports that the 3 will receive life sentences now that the death penalty is off the table. The prisoners are currently in Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. military prison in Cuba. The 3 are subject to move if the plea deal allows the U.S. to incarcerate them on their own soil. A new effort by the Senate to patch VA budget shortfalls is meeting some resistance from conservatives. Senate GOP members are showing hesitations to expedite legislation that seeks to solve the $3 billion budget shortages for the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA has told Congress it needs them to provide the mandatory benefits funds and warns veterans' compensation and pension benefit payments could be delayed if Congress does not provide the funding by September 20th. Some senators were hopeful to pass the bipartisan bill this week amid increasing concerns over the budget gaps. The unanimous consent process to expedite the bill can be held if a single senator opposes, tossing the future of the legislation up in the air before the Senate breaks for August recess. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.